In the autumn of 1944, as American forces prepared to return to the Philippines, the Imperial Japanese Navy confronted a strategic reality it had spent 3 years attempting to deny. The U.S. invasion of Leyte was not merely another amphibious landing. It was an operational challenge that struck at the core assumption upon which Japanese naval planning had been built since before the war began. That assumption was simple, coherent, and fatally outdated: that a decisive surface engagement, a single climactic fleet action, could still determine the outcome of a naval war. This belief had deep institutional roots. Japanese naval doctrine before 1940 was shaped by the legacy of Tsushima in 1905, where concentrated firepower and decisive maneuver had annihilated the Russian Baltic Fleet. From that moment forward, the Imperial Japanese Navy organized itself around the concept of kantai-kessen, the decisive battle doctrine. War, in this framework, was not won through attrition, logistics, or industrial endurance. It was won by drawing the enemy fleet into a carefully prepared engagement and destroying it in one overwhelming stroke. Even as technology changed, the underlying assumption remained intact. Aircraft carriers were incorporated into Japanese planning not as autonomous strike platforms, but as tools to weaken the enemy before the decisive surface encounter. Submarines were tasked primarily with reconnaissance and attrition in support of the same end. The fleet was structured, trained, and mentally oriented toward a future moment when battleships and cruisers would still decide the war. This assumption survived the early shocks of the Pacific War because initial events appeared to validate it. Pearl Harbor neutralized American battleships in a single surprise blow. Early carrier victories seemed to confirm that skill, planning, and offensive spirit could compensate for numerical inferiority. Even the catastrophic defeat at Midway was interpreted not as a refutation of the decisive battle concept, but as a tragic deviation, an opportunity lost due to operational misfortune rather than systemic failure. As a result, Japanese naval leadership did not abandon its foundational belief. Instead, it doubled down. By 1944, Japan's strategic situation had deteriorated beyond recognition. Its industrial base could not replace ships or aircraft at anything approaching American rates. Its trained aircrews had been bled away in prolonged carrier battles and land-based air campaigns. Fuel shortages constrained fleet training and mobility. Radar technology lagged far behind that of the United States, limiting situational awareness across vast ocean spaces. Yet the response to this decline was not doctrinal reform. It was escalation through complexity. Japanese planners concluded that the only remaining path to strategic relevance lay in engineering a decisive engagement under conditions of extreme risk. If the U.S. fleet could be surprised, divided, or misdirected, if American carriers could be drawn away, then Japanese surface forces might still penetrate invasion areas and inflict catastrophic losses on amphibious shipping. Such an outcome, it was hoped, would shock American political will and force a reassessment of the Pacific campaign. This logic placed extraordinary demands on coordination. Multiple fleets, operating from different directions, would need to converge precisely in time and space. Deception would need to function flawlessly. Communications would need to remain intact under air attack. Enemy reconnaissance would need to fail at critical moments, and U.S. commanders would need to respond exactly as Japanese planners anticipated. Each of these requirements rested on assumptions that no longer aligned with reality. By contrast, American naval doctrine had evolved in a fundamentally different direction. The U.S. Navy no longer sought a single decisive engagement in the classical sense. It pursued cumulative dominance through carrier-centric task forces, layered reconnaissance, and rapid operational adaptation. Victory did not depend on one perfect battle, but on the continuous application of pressure across multiple domains. American commanders expected friction. They planned for uncertainty. They assumed imperfect information and decentralized execution. Rather than a rigid sequence of moves, U.S. operations emphasized flexibility, allowing task force commanders to strike, reposition, and recombine as new information emerged. These two systems, Japanese decisiveness versus American adaptability, were on a collision course. The decision to defend Leyte crystallized the problem. The Philippines were strategically vital. They sat astride Japan's remaining supply routes to Southeast Asia, including access to oil resources that sustained what remained of the fleet. Losing the Philippines would not merely be a territorial defeat, it would sever Japan's operational lifeline. As a result, the Imperial Japanese Navy committed to Operation Shogo, an extraordinarily ambitious plan intended to destroy the American invasion fleet at Leyte Gulf. It was, in effect, the final expression of Kantai-Kessen thinking adapted to the carrier age. The plan divided Japanese naval power into multiple forces. A northern decoy force, built around remaining carriers with minimal air groups, would lure American fast carriers away from Leyte. Meanwhile, powerful surface forces would approach the invasion area from the west and south, pass through narrow straits, and fall upon the lightly defended transport and escort forces supporting the landings. On paper, the logic appeared sound. If the deception succeeded, American carriers, the greatest threat to Japanese surface ships, would be absent. Battleships and cruisers could then engage vulnerable amphibious shipping directly, inflicting losses disproportionate to their own strength. But this logic depended on an assumption that no longer held, that American commanders would be compelled to respond predictably to a carrier threat, and that Japanese movements could remain sufficiently concealed until the decisive moment. By October 1944, American situational awareness was not merely superior, it was systemic. Radar coverage, submarine patrols, aerial reconnaissance, and integrated command networks meant that Japanese fleet movements were detected, tracked, and evaluated long before contact was made. Even when information was incomplete or ambiguous, American doctrine allowed for rapid reassessment and adaptation. Japanese doctrine did not. The Imperial Japanese Navy entered the Battle of Leyte Gulf believing that courage, timing, and sacrifice could compensate for structural inferiority. It believed that a sufficiently bold plan could still force the kind of decisive engagement upon which its identity and its institutional memory had been built. By late October 1944, that belief was about to be tested against a naval system that no longer fought wars that way. And once the operation began, the assumption at the heart of Japanese strategy stopped being true. The plan for Leyte Gulf was not improvised. It was the logical culmination of how the Imperial Japanese Navy understood war, command, and coordination. To grasp why it failed, it is necessary to understand how it was supposed to work. Operation Shogo was built on a layered operational system that assumed precision rather than resilience. Japanese naval planning emphasized prearranged sequences, centralized intent, and synchronized movement across large distances. Success depended not on adaptability, but on timing, each element arriving exactly when expected, performing a specific role, and then withdrawing or advancing according to plan. At the center of this system was the belief that information asymmetry could still be engineered. Japanese planners assumed that by offering a visible, high-value target, the carrier decoy force to the north, they could manipulate American decision-making. U.S. carriers, it was believed, would be compelled to pursue Japanese carriers as the primary objective, leaving invasion forces exposed. This assumption shaped the entire structure of the operation. The Japanese fleet was divided into four major components. The Northern Force, under Vice Admiral Ozawa, consisted of Japan's remaining aircraft carriers. These ships carried few trained pilots and minimal aircraft, but they retained symbolic value. Their purpose was not to fight, but to be seen. The Center Force, under Vice Admiral Kurita, was the most powerful surface formation Japan could assemble. It included the battleships Yamato and Musashi, along with heavy cruisers and destroyers. This force would pass through the San Bernardino Strait and descend upon Leyte Gulf from the north, once American carriers had been drawn away. A southern force, split into two elements, would advance through the Surigao Strait from the south, converging on the same objective. In theory, the invasion area would be struck from multiple directions nearly simultaneously, overwhelming any remaining defenses. The plan required extraordinary coordination across hundreds of miles of ocean, narrow straits, and contested airspace. It also required Japanese forces to operate without reliable air cover for much of their approach. This was not an oversight. It was an accepted risk, justified by the belief that speed and surprise would compensate for vulnerability. Here, the systemic weakness became apparent. Japanese command and control architecture was not designed for dynamic adaptation. Radio silence was emphasized to avoid detection, but this limited the ability to update plans in response to changing conditions. Orders were issued with the expectation that subordinate commanders would execute them precisely, even if circumstances evolved in unexpected ways. Information flow was largely one-directional. Fleet commanders received broad operational directives, but had limited means to share real-time intelligence with one another. There was no integrated picture of the battle space, no equivalent to the American system that fused radar data, aerial reconnaissance, and submarine reports into a continuously updated operational map. This meant that Japanese forces operated on assumptions rather than verified information. American naval doctrine operated differently. By 1944, U.S. carrier task forces were designed as modular systems capable of independent action. Commanders were expected to interpret intent rather than follow rigid scripts. Communications networks were robust, redundant, and actively used. Radar-equipped ships extended detection far beyond visual range, while submarines and aircraft provided constant updates on enemy movement. As a result, American commanders did not need certainty to act. They needed probability. This difference in informational philosophy mattered profoundly. Japanese planners assumed that if their decoy carriers were detected, the Americans would respond in a predictable way by concentrating against them. American commanders, however, evaluated threats relative to mission priorities. Protecting the invasion force was not subordinate to destroying Japanese carriers. It was the central objective. The Japanese system also underestimated the impact of attrition on execution. Ships could still maneuver, but crews were less experienced. Damage control training had declined. Fuel shortages limited high-speed operations. Most critically, air power, once a decisive arm of the fleet, had been hollowed out. Carrier decks existed, but the institutional ecosystem that made them effective no longer did. Yet the plan assumed carrier behavior as if those systems were intact. Another vulnerability lay in the treatment of failure. Operation Shogo had no true contingency pathways. If the Northern Force failed to draw away American carriers, the Center Force would still proceed. If air attacks inflicted heavy losses en route, the surface forces were still expected to press on. Withdrawal was not integrated into the plan as a viable option. Success or destruction were the only envisioned outcomes. This rigidity reflected institutional culture as much as strategy. Japanese naval thought emphasized sacrifice as an acceptable operational cost. Losses were to be endured if they enabled decisive results. But this mindset assumed that decisive results were still achievable. American planning assumed the opposite. Losses were acceptable only insofar as they advanced cumulative advantage. Engagements were broken off if conditions turned unfavorable. Task forces repositioned continuously to maintain initiative. There was no requirement for a climactic moment. As the Japanese system moved toward execution, these contrasting philosophies began to interact. American submarines detected elements of the Japanese fleet as they sortied. Carrier aircraft struck Kurita's center force in the Sibuyan Sea, sinking Musashi and inflicting further damage. These attacks disrupted Japanese timing and exposed the vulnerability of surface forces without air cover. Crucially, these developments did not cause the Japanese plan to be revised. Kurita continued forward. Ozawa continued north. The system absorbed losses without adaptation because it had no mechanism to reinterpret events. American commanders, by contrast, continuously reassessed. Reports of Japanese movements were evaluated, debated, and acted upon. When uncertainty existed, it did not paralyze decision-making. It generated flexibility. The system that Japanese planners had constructed required the enemy to behave as expected. The American system required only that the enemy be detected. As Japanese forces closed in on Leyte, the gap between these two approaches widened. What had once been a carefully synchronized plan began to fragment under the weight of real-world friction. Losses, delays, misinterpretations, and incomplete information. The stress test had begun, and once events moved beyond the narrow margins within which Operation Show Go could succeed, the system offered no way back. The failure of the Japanese naval system at Leyte Gulf did not occur in a single moment. It unfolded over 4 days, through a sequence of engagements that exposed the cumulative consequences of flawed assumptions, rigid planning, and asymmetric information. The first critical rupture occurred before the main battle even began. On 23 October 1944, American submarines operating west of Palawan detected Kurita's center force as it transited toward the Philippines. This was not an incidental contact. It was the direct result of a layered reconnaissance network designed to identify enemy movement long before decisive engagement. 2 Japanese heavy cruisers were sunk and others damaged before Kurita's force ever reached contested waters. This early attrition mattered less for the ship's loss than for what it signaled. The Japanese fleet was no longer operating in concealment. Its movements were being observed, tracked, and reported in near real time. The following day, 24 October, American carrier aircraft struck Kurita's force in the Sibuyan Sea. Repeated air attacks focused on the battleship Musashi, which absorbed an extraordinary number of bombs and torpedoes before sinking. Additional ships were damaged, and the formation was disrupted. From the Japanese perspective, this was a dangerous but anticipated risk. The plan assumed losses would occur en route. What mattered was reaching Leyte Gulf. From the American perspective, these attacks served a different function. They slowed Kurita's advance, degraded his combat power, and, most importantly, generated uncertainty about his intentions. Reports indicated that Kurita might be retreating after the loss of Musashi. This assessment, while incorrect, influenced subsequent American decisions. Here, expectation and reality began to diverge in ways neither side fully understood. Admiral Halsey, commanding the U.S. Third Fleet, detected Ozawa's northern force to the north. This force included Japanese carriers, historically the most dangerous threat to American operations. Consistent with aggressive American doctrine and his own interpretation of mission priorities, Halsey concentrated his fast carriers and battleships to pursue Ozawa. This decision remains controversial, but it is essential to understand it systemically rather than personally. Halsey operated within a doctrine that rewarded initiative and offensive concentration. He assumed that Kurita's force had been neutralized or was withdrawing. The available information supported that interpretation sufficiently to justify action. What the American system did not yet fully recognize was that Kurita had reversed course and was advancing again toward the San Bernardino Strait. This created a temporary gap in American coverage. On the night of 24-25 October, Japanese southern forces attempted to transit the Surigao Strait. There, they encountered a U.S. 7th Fleet prepared specifically for such an approach. Utilizing radar-directed gunfire and a classic crossing the T maneuver, American battleships and destroyers annihilated the Japanese formation. This engagement marked the last battleship versus battleship action in history. More importantly, it demonstrated the obsolescence of Japanese surface doctrine in the face of radar, coordinated fire control, and layered defense. The Southern Force ceased to exist as a coherent combat element. Yet the most consequential failure was still to come. In the early morning hours of 25 October, Kurita's center force emerged unexpectedly off the coast of Samar. Instead of confronting heavily defended amphibious forces or major fleet units, it encountered a group of lightly armed escort carriers and destroyers, Task Unit 7743, known as Taffy 3. On paper, this was the opportunity the Japanese plan had been designed to create. Kurita's force possessed overwhelming firepower. Battleships and heavy cruisers faced escort carriers equipped primarily for anti-submarine warfare and close air support. If decisiveness were still possible, this was the moment. But the system failed even here. Japanese ships opened fire at long range, but target identification was confused. Smoke screens, aggressive destroyer attacks, and relentless American airstrikes, many conducted with minimal ordnance, disrupted Japanese formations. Communications within Kurita's force were fragmented. Commanders lacked a clear picture of enemy strength and disposition. Most critically, Kurita did not understand what he was facing. American aircraft attacks, though individually ineffective, created the illusion of a much larger carrier presence. Japanese commanders interpreted the resistance as evidence that major fleet units were nearby. This perception was reinforced by the speed and aggressiveness of American responses, hallmarks of a doctrine built on rapid concentration. Kurita faced a decision point. He could press the attack, accepting losses in pursuit of the invasion transports, or he could withdraw to preserve what remained of the fleet. His original orders emphasized destruction of enemy shipping, but they also reflected the absence of reliable intelligence and the expectation that success would require coordination with other forces, coordination that had already collapsed. At this moment, the Japanese system reached its breaking point. Kurita ordered a withdrawal. This decision did not reflect cowardice or hesitation. It reflected systemic uncertainty. The Japanese command structure had no mechanism to validate assumptions under pressure. Without confirmation of carrier absence, without air cover, and without coordinated support from other forces, pressing the attack risked annihilation without strategic gain. The decisive battle did not occur because the system that demanded it could no longer reliably produce one. Meanwhile, Ozawa's decoy carriers were destroyed by Halsey's forces to the north. Their sacrifice achieved only partial success. American carriers had been drawn away, but not long enough or decisively enough to enable Japanese surface forces to exploit the opening. By the end of 25 October, Japanese naval power had been shattered across multiple engagements. Ships remained afloat, but coherence was gone. Command structures had fragmented. The operational logic that had governed Japanese naval warfare for decades had been exposed as incompatible with modern conditions. The failure at Leyte Gulf was not the result of a single bad decision. It was the cumulative outcome of a system that required perfection to succeed and offered no margin for error. Once friction entered the equation, collapse became inevitable. The immediate aftermath of the Battle of Leyte Gulf did not resemble a conventional defeat. The Imperial Japanese Navy still possessed surviving battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. On paper, it remained a fleet. What had been destroyed was not the inventory, but the system that gave those ships meaning. What commanders did not yet fully understand in October 1944 was that Leyte Gulf marked the irreversible transition of the Japanese Navy from an operational instrument into a symbolic force. The battle did not end Japanese naval resistance overnight, but it eliminated the possibility of coordinated large-scale fleet action for the remainder of the war. The consequences unfolded unevenly but relentlessly. In the immediate term, American commanders consolidated their control of the Philippines. The invasion of Leyte continued uninterrupted. Amphibious shipping, the primary target of Operation Shogo, remained largely intact. Supply lines were secured, airfields expanded, and follow-on operations accelerated. Japanese naval losses extended beyond sunk ships. Fuel reserves were depleted in vain sorties. Remaining vessels were dispersed to secondary ports where they could neither train nor maneuver effectively. Carrier aviation, already a hollow capability, ceased to exist as a coherent arm. Pilots could no longer be replaced, and flight operations became sporadic and defensive. Just as critically, Japanese command confidence eroded. The belief that a decisive naval counterstroke could alter the course of the war collapsed. Subsequent operations reflected this shift. Surface ships were increasingly held in reserve, employed as stationary batteries, or sacrificed in desperate, localized actions rather than integrated campaigns. The full impact would only become clear later. With the Philippines secured, the United States severed Japan's access to vital resources in Southeast Asia. Oil shipments dwindled to a trickle. Industrial output declined further. The strategic isolation that Japanese leaders had sought to avoid became unavoidable. American naval doctrine, by contrast, emerged reinforced. Leyte Gulf validated carrier-centric operations, distributed command, and information-driven decision-making. Even moments of confusion, such as the temporary exposure off Samar, were absorbed by a system designed to recover quickly from uncertainty. Importantly, American commanders did not interpret Leyte as a narrowly won gamble. They understood it as confirmation that their approach did not require perfection. Redundancy, flexibility, and cumulative pressure were sufficient. The Japanese system had required a single decisive success to justify enormous risk. The American system required only continued functioning. This asymmetry shaped the remainder of the Pacific War. Subsequent battles, at Iwo Jima, Okinawa, and beyond, were fought under conditions of overwhelming American naval dominance. Japanese surface forces played little strategic role. When they did sortie, it was often in symbolic or sacrificial missions divorced from any realistic operational objective. The lesson of Leyte Gulf was therefore not about bravery, competence, or resolve. Japanese sailors fought with determination throughout the battle. Individual actions, particularly during the engagement off Samar, demonstrated extraordinary courage on both sides. But courage could not compensate for structural imbalance. What failed at Leyte Gulf was a theory of victory. The Imperial Japanese Navy had built itself around the idea that war could still be decided by a single, orchestrated confrontation. That theory depended on assumptions about information control, coordination, and predictability that no longer held in a battle space dominated by radar, air power, and continuous reconnaissance. Correction was impossible because acknowledging the failure would have required dismantling the institution's intellectual foundation. By 1944, there was no time fuel, or industrial capacity to rebuild doctrine, retrain forces, and reconfigure command structures, even if the need had been fully recognized. The American Navy, by contrast, did not seek decisive battles in the classical sense. It sought operational inevitability. Each engagement reduced Japanese options, constrained movement, and widened the gap in capability. Victory emerged not from a single moment, but from the accumulation of advantages that no counterstroke could reverse. Leyte Gulf stands as the moment when this divergence became unmistakable. Japan retained ships after the battle. It retained officers, crews, and traditions. What it no longer possessed was a viable fleet system, one capable of sensing, deciding, and acting faster than its opponent. In modern warfare, as in 1944, institutions that rely on perfection collapse under friction. Those that plan for uncertainty endure. That was the final lesson of Leyte Gulf.